Hi class, this week we're going to be talking about the digestive system and also a little bit about nutrition. So first, let's talk about the digestive tract itself. So the digestive system actually spans from your oral cavity or your mouth all the way to your anus, and it's a really long tube and it's continuous throughout your entire body. It's also known as the alimentary canal or the GI tract or gastrointestinal tract. Its main functions are digestion and absorption. Digestion is going to be the physical breakdown of food, either mechanically or chemically. And absorption is going to be taking that broken down food and using those nutrients to be able for energy in our bodies. So the wall of the GI tract is broken down into 4 different parts. So starting with the innermost part is the mucosa. So the mucosa is going to surround the opening of the canal, which is going to be called the lumen. So the mucosa is going to have all of these epithelial tissues, and it's going to surround the lumen. Surrounding the mucosa is going to be the submucosa. The submucosa is going to have a lot of glands, blood vessels, and nerves to support the mucosal lining. The muscularis layer is next, and it's going to have a lot of muscular tissue in order to help propel food through the GI tract. And the serosa is going to be the most superficial layer, so it's going to be the outer part of the tube that you can see. And that's going to be directly connected to the visceral peritoneum. So it'll blend right into the visceral peritoneum in most cases. And that's the serosa. The oral cavity is our mouth, and it's going to consist of everything that you can see in your mouth. So the lips are your outermost portion of your mouth, and they're going to sense temperatures and textures before they enter your body. They also help us in forming speech sounds. You may notice like different languages move their lips differently than others, and it's hard to create sound without moving your lips unless you are a ventriloquist. Your cheeks then form the inner part of the sides of your mouth, the lateral borders. They're going to have a lot of muscles behind them to help you chew and to pucker your lips. The hard palate is going to form the roof of your mouth, and the soft palate also, but toward the posterior aspect of the roof of your mouth. The hard and soft palate are going to help with chewing, and they also form that base of the nasal cavity, so it separates the mouth from the nose. Your teeth are also in your oral cavity. We'll talk about those way more in detail. Then you also have the uvula, which is the little hanging punching bag looking structure in the very back of your throat. The uvula has a really important function. When you swallow, it is going to cover the opening of your nasal cavity in the back of your throat so that liquids and foods don't go into your nose. So sometimes that'll fail and you might laugh and milk might come out of your nose or whatever liquid you're drinking. So the tongue is also part of your oral cavity. It's going to be anchored to your mouth by the lingual frenulum, this little guy. So if you look at the ventral surface of your tongue, the underside, you will likely see a lingual frenulum, unless for some reason you had yours cut. In some cases, that is done. The frenulum have a rich blood supply, and they have a really thin epithelial layer of tissue there. So that's why it's really efficient for sublingual medications to be given. Especially in cases like heart attacks, they might put a tablet under your tongue, and it diffuses really quickly in your system because of that thin layer of epithelium and that rich blood supply. It goes straight to your blood and works really quickly. Your tongue, its function is to move food during mastication, which is a fancy word for chewing, and deglutition, which is a fancy word for swallowing. So during chewing and swallowing, the tongue is moving food throughout your mouth and into the back of your throat to your pharynx. It also moves during speech to help with speech patterns, and different languages use their tongues to different extents. You also have 3 pairs of salivary glands in your oral cavity. The parotid gland is the biggest salivary gland, and it's going to sit a little anterior to your ear. Sometimes your parotid gland can be swollen or infected if you eat a lot of salty foods. And then you might have, your face might swell up on one side. The submandibular gland means that it's below the mandible, which means it's below the jaw. So it's right below the jaw on either side. And then the sublingual gland is going to be underneath the tongue. But in all these cases, you can't see these glands because they're underneath all of these tissues to protect them. And these salivary glands are going to produce saliva, which have a lot of enzymes in them. So that's going to be the start of the breakdown of food in your mouth. So that's most of the purpose of saliva. It's going to not only wet food to be able to mix it and make it smaller, but it also has these enzymes in it to help break it down even quicker. So you also have teeth that are in your mouth. Their purpose is to cut, tear, and grind food to be mixed with that saliva to make it even smaller. Once food is mixed with saliva, it's called a bolus. It's like a lump of food mixed with saliva. The part of the tooth that you can see is called the crown. And the part that inserts into your jaw is called the root. So if you had a root canal, it's on the root part of your tooth. And the tooth is covered by enamel, which is the hardest substance in your entire body, harder than bones. So imagine that if things that are really acidic that you're putting into your body are tearing away your enamel, the hardest thing in your entire body, imagine what it's doing to the rest of your body. Incisors are going to be a type of tooth that are used for tearing, especially large amounts of meat. Your molars are toward the back of your mouth, and they're going to be used for grinding, especially for plants. Different animals have different types of teeth depending on what the things they are that they eat. So, like, you can see big cats like lions and tigers that have these giant incisors, and those are used to rip meat because they're carnivores. But cows have really, teeth that a lot of them resemble molars. They don't have these sharp teeth to rip things because they eat more grasses and plants. So you have 20 deciduous teeth. Those are your baby teeth. And the first one is going to erupt around 6 months. There's a lot of variation in this. Those of you who are parents know that. Usually those baby teeth are all shed between 6 to 13 years old. The last teeth that come in are your third molars or your wisdom teeth, and that's around 17. Again, tons of variation, but that's the average. So those deciduous teeth kind of sit on top of your permanent teeth when they're in your jaw before they erupt through the skin through your gums. And then those permanent teeth come in and take their spot. So you have 32 permanent teeth, 16 on your upper jaw, 16 on your lower jaw. We've talked about the pharynx before when we talked about respiratory system. Remember that the nasal cavity is going to enter the pharynx, and the pharynx is going to split into the larynx and the esophagus. So the pharynx is going to move the bolus of food from the mouth into the esophagus. The esophagus sits behind the trachea, just posterior to it, and it's collapsible. So remember, the trachea is cartilaginous and it always stays open. The esophagus doesn't. It's a very flimsy tube, but it's way longer than the trachea. And the reason why it's collapsible is so that when food passes through, it doesn't get constricted and stuck in these very confined spaces. It kind of, there's a little bit more wiggle room in the esophagus than there would be in the trachea. So it's about 12 inches long, and it travels from the pharynx all the way to the stomach. So it has to pierce through the diaphragm in order to enter the stomach at the cardiac portion of the stomach. There are two different sphincters, which are kind of like valves. They open and close depending on the stimulus. So there's an upper esophageal sphincter, which is going to be where the pharynx ends. And that will prevent air from getting into the digestive tract when you breathe in. So that upper esophageal sphincter is closed unless your body knows that you're eating, in which case that stimulus will cause your upper esophageal sphincter to open to allow food to pass from the pharynx into the esophagus. Same thing happens with the lower esophageal sphincter. That also doesn't open until there's a stimulus of a bolus. And when that bolus is traveling through the esophagus, that lower esophageal sphincter will open and allow food to travel into the stomach. Sometimes with diets that are really high in fat, that lower esophageal sphincter can be too relaxed or not like very well formed. Sometimes babies have really relaxed lower esophageal sphincters, especially if they're premature, which can cause GERD or gastroesophageal reflux disease, also known as heartburn. So if your lower esophageal sphincter is too relaxed, it's allowing some of that acid that's in your stomach to splash back up into your esophagus, causing that phenomenon known as heartburn or GERD. So the esophagus leads into the stomach via that lower esophageal sphincter. There are 4 parts to the stomach. The cardia is the part where the esophagus enters. The fundus is the upper part of the stomach where it kind of curves upwards. So cardia, fundus, the body of the stomach. And then the lower region where it starts to curve again is known as the pylorus. Adult stomachs hold volumes of 1 to 1.5 liters. This definitely changes depending on your weight, because the stomach can stretch or distend over time, depending on how much food you generally hold in it. It can also become a little bit smaller, depending or if you don't do a lot of eating. There are these rugae, or tiny little folds within the stomach, and that increases its surface area to allow for more to be held within the stomach. Stomach also has gastric glands. It's produced gastric juice to allow for more digestion of food. So the pylorus is a region of the lower part of the stomach where if you ever have gastric ulcers, if you have ulcers in your stomach, if you eat a lot of acidic foods, they're going to be in the pyloric region, likely. You could also have duodenal ulcers, but they would be right on the other side of this pyloric sphincter. So just like there's a sphincter at the entrance to the stomach, there's also a sphincter where the stomach ends and becomes the small intestine, and the part that it goes into is known as the duodenum. So the pyloric sphincter is generally closed, so acid doesn't go into the small intestine until a food bolus comes through and stimulates it to open. So there could be ulcers on either side of the sphincter. So there are a couple different cells within the stomach. There are chief cells, and they're going to secrete the gastric juices. They're going to have some enzymes that help break down the food further. The parietal cells are going to secrete hydrochloric acid, which has a pH around 2. It's going to help really break down that food. It also secretes intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is really important because it's a factor that's needed for one of our vitamins, B12, in order for B12 to be functional. Without it, we could become anemic. And then there's also endocrine cells, and they secrete ghrelin. Like we talked about before, ghrelin stimulates hunger. So when the stomach is rather empty, it might secrete ghrelin so that your brain knows that it should start eating. So we've said that the stomach functions as a food reservoir. It secretes gastric juice that has enzymes to break down this food further. It churns food and it breaks it into smaller particles. As you can kind of tell here, the stomach is a rather muscular organ. It churns food kind of like a washing machine. It mixes it together with this acid. It secretes intrinsic factor. There's a little bit of absorption that happens here, but not much. It's going to happen mostly in the small intestine. It's going to produce gastrin and ghrelin, and it destroys any pathogenic bacteria. Like we said, from the respiratory system, anything that's not drained through the nasal cavity will go down the throat into the stomach, where pathogenic bacteria will be disposed of by this stomach acid. The small intestine is called the small intestine because it's not super wide, but it is really long. It's about 20 feet long, which is way longer than most expect it to be, just because it's so coiled. It's about 1 inch wide, and it's split up into 3 different sections. So on this picture, the purple part is known as the duodenum. Some people say duodenum. Then it goes into the jejunum, and the jejunum turns into the ileum. So the duodenum is the part that the stomach inserts into. So we went from the oral cavity to the pharynx, to the esophagus, to the stomach, to the duodenum, to the jejunum, and to the ileum. So that's all of everything from the mouth to the small intestine. A lot of the small intestine has villi and microvilli to increase the surface area. This is where a lot of the absorption takes place in the body. Most of the absorption of nutrients is through the small intestine. The tissues in the small intestine also have goblet cells, which secrete mucus, which also helps with digestion. The large intestine is called that because it is large in diameter, but it's not very long. So from the small intestine, we had the duodenum coming from the stomach, to the jejunum, to the ileum. The ileum wraps around and inserts into the cecum. So the cecum is going to be the start of the large intestine, and that's where the appendix hangs off of. The cecum then turns into the ascending colon, because it's ascending, transverse colon, descending colon, and where it turns into kind of an S shape, it's known as the sigmoid colon, and then the rectum is straight down. The rectum turns into the anal canal, which would be more right before it becomes external. So that large intestine is about 5 to 6 feet in length. It's about 2.3 inches in diameter in width, but it gets smaller or less wide toward the end. It has peristaltic waves 2 to 3 times a day, and what that means is the muscles contract in this wave-like pattern to push food along. In the cecum, there's also what's called the ileocecal valve, and that's just going to connect that ileum to the cecum. The appendix hangs off of the cecum. It's usually 3 to 4 inches in length. It generally serves as a breeding ground for bacteria, for good bacteria that's in our body. Sometimes it can become impacted by feces, and it becomes infected because of all of this bacteria, and that's when people have to get their appendix removed. The peritoneum is going to be this long sheath that covers all of the abdominal organs. It holds them in a general place. It's not very... it still allows for a little bit of movement. The parietal peritoneum is going to be adhered to the abdominal cavity, so that outer wall, but the visceral peritoneum will be continuous with all of the organs. There will be a little bit of fluid between those, just like in the pleura, to allow for, to make sure that there's no friction. There's also a mesentery. It's this covering over the organs, and it prevents strangulation of the intestines. So it allows them to move around without twisting upon themselves. So we talked about the appendix. That was one of our first accessory organs of the GI system. The liver is our next one. It's our largest gland in the body. It's our largest organ within the body. Our largest organ of the body is the skin, but within the body it's the liver. It weighs 3 to 4 pounds. Its job is to make bile. It has some other jobs too, but important to the digestive system. It makes the bile, which is going to help break down fats. It secretes bile through the hepatic ducts, right and left, and those come into a common hepatic duct, and they merge with the cystic duct of the gallbladder to form the common bile duct. The common bile duct is going to take bile and deposit it into the duodenum to help break down fats. So the liver also detoxifies things in your body. As you may know, it gets impaired with excessive drinking. It metabolizes proteins, fats, and carbs. It stores all of your fat-soluble vitamins and minerals, iron, vitamin A, even B12 and D. It produces plasma proteins and is even a site of red blood cell production, hematopoiesis. And it makes up about a pint of bile a day. So if you don't need that much bile, it's then stored in the gallbladder. So the gallbladder is 3 to 4 inches long, 3 centimeters broad or wide. It holds about 30 to 50 milliliters of bile. And then it takes the bile and concentrates it and ejects it into the duodenum, again, to break down fats. So your gallbladder is not one of your vital organs. It's hard to have a normal diet without your gallbladder. Generally, you have to take bile salts as a supplement in order to break down fats as you once could. The pancreas is a little bit posterior to the stomach. It's 6 to 9 inches long and weighs about 60 grams. And it looks kind of more like a gland than an organ. That's because, it is an endocrine gland, but it also is mostly an exocrine gland. So its main job is to actually do more digestion and secrete all of these digestive juices that have all these enzymes in them to help break down the food that we eat. So the acinar units of the pancreas is what's going to secrete those digestive enzymes, and it puts them right into the duodenum, about the same area as the bile duct is going to enter. And since all of these digestive enzymes from both the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas are all entering, and the stomach are all entering into the duodenum, that's why most of the absorption takes place at the small intestine level. So we talked about digestion versus absorption. Ingestion is the actual taking food into the body. Assimilation occurs after absorption, so after you've taken in those nutrients, it's using those nutrients to make parts of a cell. And then elimination is taking any unused nutrients or any unused food particles and removing them from the body. There's two different types of digestion, mechanical and chemical. Mechanical is going to be anything that physically is breaking that food into smaller pieces. So once the bolus is no longer, like a solid mass, it's turned into chyme. So once the stomach has mixed it all together with the acid and has churned it into little particles, it's called chyme. Mastication is a part of mechanical digestion because you're physically breaking down this food with chewing. Deglutition is part of mechanical digestion because you're pushing food down the throat to swallow it. There's an oral stage where the food is in the mouth and the tongue pushes it to the back of the throat. Once it's in the back of the throat, it's the pharyngeal stage, and once the food enters the esophagus from the pharynx, it becomes the esophageal phase. Peristalsis is a wave-like motion that helps to push food along. So it's this little contractions that come in like a wave-like pattern throughout the intestines. Segmentation is more of a mixing movement, kind of like the stomach does when it churns the food. Kind of like a washing machine. That's going to be what segmentation is. So both peristalsis and segmentation happen at multiple points throughout the GI tract, in the stomach, in the intestines, and so on. So the stomach takes about 2 to 6 hours to empty after you've eaten. And like I said, it forms a chyme, so it's more of a particles mixed with the acid. Every about 20 seconds, it ejects some of that chyme into the duodenum via propulsion. So that pyloric sphincter will open like a valve, and it'll eject a little bit of the chyme under pressure, and that's going to be propulsion. Through the intestines, they're going to move food along through peristalsis and segmentation, so pushing it via contraction and also churning it. After the food leaves the stomach, it takes about 5 hours to leave the small intestine and enter the large intestine. So it's quite a long process after you eat a meal. So that was all mechanical digestion. Chemical digestion is taking place through enzymes. So there are enzymes all throughout your body that are going to speed up chemical reactions and help to break things down from a chemical standpoint. There are certain enzymes called amylases that help to break down starch, so they're going to break down carbohydrates. There's a salivary amylase, so you have that the breakdown of carbs will start in your mouth, and it will continue in the small intestine when that pancreatic amylase is sent to the duodenum to help break down food further. There's also proteases, and proteases help to break down protein. So the stomach is one of the first places that really starts to break down the protein. Then trypsin is produced by the pancreas, and it's going to release that enzyme into the small intestine, into the duodenum, to continue the breakdown of the protein so that it can be absorbed. Lipases break down lipids or fats, and they will be combined with bile salts from the gallbladder and the liver in order to break down lipids even faster. So lipases are found in the small intestine as well, coming from the pancreas. So this diagram shows some of the places of absorption in the body. Most of the nutrients are absorbed in the small intestine and the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and most of the water is absorbed by the large intestine. So absorption is the physical passage of these nutrients into blood and lymph to be used in assimilation. Elimination is going to be the expulsion of all of the residues of digestion, everything that we couldn't use, via the feces in a process called defecation. During constipation, too much water has been absorbed in the large intestine and it's taking too long to get through the system, and that can cause delays with defecation. Diarrhea is what occurs when things move through the digestive system too quickly. So that would mean that the large intestine doesn't have enough time to absorb the water, and it results in more loose, watery stools, which can be really bad because if it's moving too quickly through the digestive system, that means that nutrients don't have a chance to be absorbed by the small intestine. So over time, if this continues, it can lead to a lot of issues with dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. So if you're somebody who's really into nutrition, you probably keep track of your macronutrients and your micronutrients. Your macronutrients are going to be things like your proteins, your carbohydrates, and your lipids. And your micronutrients are going to be things like vitamins, minerals, and all of the trace elements of things that we would find in our diets or a multivitamin supplement. So first we'll talk about carbohydrates. They're going to be mainly in plant starches, your starchy vegetables like potatoes and cauliflower, grains like cereals and breads and pastas, cellulose, that's one of our types of carbohydrates that we cannot break down. So celery is a really great example of something that is really highly composed of cellulose. So it's used as a form of dietary fiber that we can't physically break down. Refined sugars and fruits are also considered to be carbohydrates. So anything that you consider sugary would also be under this category. So remember that amylases are going to be breaking down carbohydrates into smaller sugars that we can use. Carbohydrates are going to be our main source of energy in our body. So cholesterol is one of our types of lipids, and the only place that you can get it is from products of animal origin. So liver, shrimp, egg yolks, etc. are really high in cholesterol, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are good types of cholesterol, and cholesterol is needed in our bodies in order to make some of our cell membranes. So those people who are vegan and don't eat animal products would then make their own cholesterol, not get it from animal products. The types of fats that are in our body or in our diets: saturated fats, trans fats, and unsaturated fats. So remember that trans fats and saturated fats are the worst ones for you. Trans fats being the absolute worst, being found in some of our more processed foods like cookies, crackers, anything that you might find in a box or packaged from the store. Saturated fats will be things like butter, margarine, coconut oil is considered high in saturated fats. Monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats are the best for you. Found in things like tree nuts, seeds, extra virgin olive oil, and avocados are all really good sources of good fats. Lipoproteins will carry cholesterol throughout your body. So this is showing a cholesterol panel, something that you might see if you get blood cholesterol taken to check to see if your cholesterol levels are too high. So LDL cholesterol is going to be our bad cholesterol. So high levels of LDL are not good, and LDL, when it's high, shows that the cholesterol that is being transported in your body is likely being transported to areas like adipose cells and arteries, which can contribute to atherosclerosis, heart disease, heart attacks, and strokes. HDL cholesterol is our good cholesterol, so higher levels are better, and it actually is indicative of a lower incidence of heart disease and strokes. Triglycerides are also bad. There are free-floating fats in our body. So when you see a cholesterol panel and you see LDL and triglycerides that are high, that's an indication that you should probably eat less animal products and more poly and monounsaturated fats. Our dietary sources of protein. So remember that amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Only 10 of the 20 amino acids that you need you can get from just making them in your body. The rest you have to get from the diet. So most people in this country are deficient in protein because they think that they're eating things that are high in protein when they're usually not. However, there is the other end of it where people who do a lot of weightlifting and exercise and athletes, they might have too much protein in their bodies or in their diets, which can also be a bad thing because it can be really bad for your kidneys. Sources of proteins come from meat, from grains like cereals or quinoa or lentils, any nuts and legumes like beans. Are all really good sources of proteins. Vitamins are separated into two categories, fat-soluble and water-soluble. This is really important because fat-soluble means that these vitamins are stored. So these are vitamins that you generally don't need high amounts of all the time because your body stores them and uses them when they're needed. That means that if you take too much of these fat-soluble vitamins, you can actually overdose on them, and they can cause a lot of different complications in your body. For example, if you take too much vitamin A, you can have liver failure. Vitamin A is used specifically is really good for your eyesight. If you're having issues driving at night because you can't see very well, it may very well be because you need more vitamin A in your diet. So you can get that from things like carrots, red meats, although that's not it's not a source of the better form of vitamin A. Carrots are better. Vitamin D, I can tell you that most people are vitamin D deficient, especially in this part of the country because we don't get enough sun compared to a lot of the other parts of the country. So vitamin D is made by your skin when exposed to sunlight. Vitamin E is a really good antioxidant, and it's good for if you bruise easily. It maintains integrity of blood vessels, and it keeps your skin strong. Antioxidants prevent you from getting cancer, so having more antioxidants in the body is really good. Vitamin K is made by the bacteria in your gut, and it helps with blood clotting. So having a really good gut microbiome is really beneficial. The water-soluble vitamins are all of our B vitamins and also vitamin C. B1 is thiamine, and it's important for carbohydrate metabolism. B2 is riboflavin. Sometimes when people are deficient in riboflavin, they might notice scalloping or waviness on the lateral borders of their tongue. B3 is niacin, and it's really important for energy. So if you're feeling really fatigued, a B complex might be a really good thing to introduce to your supplement regimen. Niacin can be made from tryptophan. So if you're eating a lot of protein, a lot of meats as protein, you might be getting a lot of niacin that way. B5 is pantothenic acid, and it's really important for managing stress. B6, B9, and B12 are really important in preventing cancer. And these are also vitamins that are all deficient in people that are taking oral contraceptives. So if you are taking oral contraceptives and you're not supplementing with a multivitamin or a B complex, it's really important that you do so to help lower your risk of obtaining some of these cancers. B9 and B12, when they are deficient, it's possible to get different types of anemia. B9 is also a vitamin that's really important in preventing spina bifida, so you might see this in high levels in prenatal vitamins. B7 is biotin, and it's helpful for hair, skin, and nails. And if you're deficient in biotin, you'll be deficient in all of your other B vitamins because biotin is needed in order for the rest of them to be absorbed. Vitamin C is also a really good antioxidant, so it's good at preventing cancers and genetic mutations. It's also really helpful for your immune system. This chart shows different ways that you can get the minerals that are needed for your body. I would recommend that you don't take minerals by themselves. You should take them in conjunction with a multivitamin, because some of these, when they're taken in too high amounts, they can cause really bad side effects for your body. For example, taking an iron supplement, you can very easily have iron toxicity and overdose on iron. So unless it's prescribed by a doctor, I would not recommend that. For example, when kids used to take Flintstone vitamins, they used to have a lot of iron in Flintstone vitamins, and they had to take it out because kids thought they were like candy, and they would eat tons of them, and they would get really sick from this iron toxicity. It's okay if there's iron in multivitamins, but you should just make sure that you're taking the recommended amount. Also, things like potassium, if you're taking just a potassium supplement by itself, and it's not recommended by and it wasn't prescribed by your doctor, I would not recommend to take a potassium supplement by itself either, because it can cause heart arrhythmias at too high of levels. So these are all minerals that you can find in the foods that you're eating, and they're really important for your everyday function. So let me know if you have any questions for this week. Make sure you're following along in your book, and make sure you're following along in your notes, since the audio and the video are lagging quite a bit.